What if the first 3 minutes after you wake up, minutes most people move through on autopilot without a second thought, are quietly setting up either a stable, steady day or a shaky, uncomfortable one? Most people think the moment they open their eyes marks the true start of their day, and whatever happens next, reaching for a phone, swinging their legs out of bed, heading straight for the kitchen, feels like simply getting on with things. But after 50, your body handles that first transition from sleep to full wakefulness differently than it did decades earlier, and there are 3 specific habits, extremely common, rarely questioned, that can quietly work against your balance, your blood pressure, your mood, and your energy for hours afterward. So today we're going to walk through exactly what these 3 habits are, the specific physiological reasons each one becomes more consequential after 50, and precisely what to do instead so your mornings support you rather than working against you before you've even left the bedroom. Before we begin, remember this video is for education only. If you experience fainting, significant dizziness upon standing, or a fall related to morning dizziness, please speak with your doctor, since these can sometimes indicate an underlying condition requiring direct medical evaluation. Now let's begin. Most people ask, what's the best thing to do first thing in the morning? But that's actually the less useful half of this conversation. The better question is, what are the specific things I should avoid doing in those first few minutes, regardless of what positive routine I eventually build? Because avoiding a handful of genuinely counterproductive habits often matters more than adding an elaborate new routine on top of them, particularly since these 3 habits are so deeply automatic for most people that they rarely get questioned or examined at all. Here is why these particular 3 habits become more consequential after 50 specifically. Your nervous system's transition from the deep, restful state of sleep into full daytime alertness naturally becomes somewhat less smooth and gradual with age, meaning any additional jolt or demand placed on that transition tends to have a more noticeable effect than it would have decades earlier. Blood vessel flexibility and the body's ability to quickly adjust blood pressure in response to changes in body position, such as moving from lying down to standing, also becomes somewhat less efficient with age, a factor directly relevant to one of the 3 habits we're about to discuss. And blood sugar regulation, as we've discussed in other conversations, becomes somewhat less forgiving after 50, meaning certain morning choices around food and timing can produce more pronounced effects than they once did. Think of your body first thing in the morning like a small business opening for the day. If the doors are unlocked calmly, the lights are turned on gradually, and the register is checked before the first customer walks in, the whole operation eases into its busy hours smoothly. But if the doors are thrown open before anyone has had a chance to prepare, if the first customer walks in demanding something complicated before the coffee machine has even finished warming up, the entire morning feels rushed and reactive rather than calm and controlled, even though the business is fundamentally capable of handling the day just fine once it's properly underway. Your body's transition from sleep to wakefulness works in a remarkably similar way, and the 3 habits we're discussing today are essentially the equivalent of throwing the doors open before anything has had a chance to properly prepare. Let's start with the first thing you should never do right after waking up after 50, and that is reaching immediately for your phone within the first few minutes of opening your eyes. This has become an almost universal habit, checking messages, emails, news, or social media within seconds of waking, often before even sitting up in bed. Here is exactly why this matters more than most people realize. Your body naturally releases a surge of cortisol upon waking, a completely normal part of your daily rhythm often called the cortisol awakening response, which helps you feel alert and ready to begin your day. This surge is already a significant physiological event happening in the background, and introducing potentially stressful or demanding information, a work email, a piece of concerning news, a stressful message, directly into that already elevated cortisol state compounds and extends the stress response rather than allowing it to settle naturally as it's designed to do. Beyond the cortisol connection, immediately engaging with a bright screen also forces your eyes and your visual processing system to jump straight into focused, demanding work before they've had any gentle transition time, and the content itself, frequently including comparison-inducing social media or anxiety-provoking news, primes your nervous system for a reactive, stress state right from the very first moments of your day, rather than a calmer, more intentional beginning. Over time, this pattern of morning after morning beginning with an immediate stress trigger can contribute to a general sense of starting each day already slightly behind, already reactive, rather than starting from a place of calm control. The fix involves keeping your phone in another room overnight, or if that's not practical, placing it across the room rather than on your nightstand, so that reaching for it requires you to first get up, move around, and have a few minutes of buffer before engaging with anything on the screen. Even a simple 5 to 10 minute delay before checking your phone, spend instead on slow breathing, gentle stretching, or simply lying still for a moment, allows your body's natural cortisol surge to begin settling into a calmer pattern before you introduce additional stimulation on top of it. Now let's talk about the second thing you should never do right after waking up after 50, and this one involves the specific way you get out of bed itself, sitting up quickly and standing immediately without any gradual transition. Here is precisely why this matters, and it involves a genuine physiological mechanism worth understanding in detail. When you're lying down for an extended period, such as during a full night of sleep, blood tends to pool somewhat more in your lower body and settle into a distribution suited for a horizontal position. When you sit up and stand quickly, your cardiovascular system needs to rapidly adjust, constricting certain blood vessels and increasing heart rate slightly to maintain adequate blood flow to your brain against the pull of gravity now working against you in an upright position. In younger adults, this adjustment typically happens quickly and smoothly, without any noticeable effect. However, after 50, this reflex, called the bear reflex, tends to respond somewhat more slowly and less efficiently, meaning a rapid transition from lying down to standing can produce a brief, noticeable drop in blood pressure before your body catches up, a phenomenon called orthostatic hypotension, which can produce dizziness, lightheadedness, or in some cases a genuine fall risk, particularly first thing in the morning when this reflex has had all night to become even less primed for a sudden change. This is one of the most commonly overlooked contributors to morning falls among older adults, precisely because the habit of jumping straight out of bed feels so automatic and unremarkable that it's rarely connected back to the dizziness or unsteadiness that sometimes follows. The fix involves a simple three-stage transition. First, spend 30 to 60 seconds simply lying still after your eyes open, allowing your body a moment before any movement begins. Second, sit up slowly and pause at the edge of the bed for another 30 seconds or so, allowing your cardiovascular system to adjust to the new, partially upright position before going further. Third, stand up slowly, ideally with a hand on a nearby sturdy piece of furniture for balance and support during that first moment of standing, rather than standing up briskly and immediately walking away. This entire stage transition takes only an extra minute or two but gives your body's blood pressure regulation system genuine time to catch up with your change in position, meaningfully reducing the risk of morning dizziness or falls. Now let's talk about the third and final thing you should never do right after waking up after 50, and that is eating a breakfast heavily weighted toward refined carbohydrates and added sugar, such as sugary cereal, pastries, or a large glass of fruit juice, particularly on its own without any protein or fiber alongside it. Here is why this specific pattern matters more after 50 than it may have in earlier decades. As discussed in other conversations about blood sugar, insulin sensitivity naturally declines somewhat with age, meaning your body's ability to efficiently manage an incoming rush of sugar becomes less robust over time. Eating a breakfast heavily weighted toward refined carbohydrates and sugar, especially first thing in the morning when your body is already managing an elevated cortisol level that itself tends to raise blood sugar somewhat, creates a combination that can produce a more pronounced, longer blood sugar spike than the same breakfast might have produced decades earlier. This spike is often followed by a corresponding drop as your body works to bring blood sugar back down, frequently producing that familiar mid-morning slump, a sudden dip in energy and focus that many people simply accept as a normal part of their day without connecting it back to their breakfast choice. Beyond the energy crash, repeated daily patterns of significant blood sugar spikes followed by drops are also associated with increased long-term risk for insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes, making this a habit worth reconsidering not just for how you feel that particular morning, but for your broader metabolic health over the years ahead. The fix involves restructuring your breakfast to include a genuine source of protein, such as eggs, plain yogurt, or a small amount of cottage cheese, alongside any carbohydrates you choose to include, and favoring whole, less processed carbohydrate sources, such as oats or whole fruit, over refined options like sugary cereal or pastries. Protein specifically slows the rate at which any accompanying carbohydrates are digested and absorbed, helping to produce a more gradual, moderate blood sugar rise rather than a sharp spike, and this single adjustment, adding protein to your existing breakfast rather than overhauling everything you eat, tends to be one of the more sustainable, realistic changes people are able to maintain consistently over the long term. Now, before we go further, let's debunk a few common myths about mornings and these three habits specifically. For years, many people believed that checking a phone immediately upon waking is simply a harmless, neutral habit with no real physiological consequence, since it doesn't involve physical movement or eating. Some believed that any dizziness upon standing quickly is simply a fleeting, meaningless sensation rather than a genuine signal from a cardiovascular system that needs a moment to catch up. Some believed that as long as breakfast contains some nutritional value, the specific balance of carbohydrates versus protein doesn't meaningfully matter. And some believed that morning habits established over years or decades are essentially fixed and not worth reconsidering at this stage of life. But when we look at the actual physiological mechanisms involved, cortisol and stress response, the bear reflex and blood pressure regulation, and insulin sensitivity and blood sugar management, the picture becomes considerably more actionable. The real questions are not simply, does this habit feel harmless, or have I always done things this particular way? The better questions are, am I introducing potentially stressful stimulation directly into an already elevated cortisol state? Am I giving my cardiovascular system adequate time to adjust to a change in body position before demanding full upright activity? And am I including protein alongside any carbohydrates in my first meal of the day, to moderate rather than spike my blood sugar right from the start? These are genuinely modifiable habits, regardless of how long they've been part of your particular morning routine. Now let's build a simple, practical approach to correcting these 3 habits starting tomorrow morning. First, move your phone out of arm's reach overnight, whether to another room entirely or simply across your bedroom, and commit to at least 5 to 10 minutes of phone-free time after waking before checking any messages, news, or notifications. Second, practice the stage transition out of bed, 30 to 60 seconds lying still, 30 seconds sitting at the edge of the bed, then standing slowly with support nearby, rather than sitting up and standing in one quick, continuous motion. Third, restructure your breakfast to include a genuine source of protein alongside any carbohydrates, favoring whole, less processed carbohydrate options over refined sugar and pastries, and if you enjoy fruit juice, considering whether a smaller portion alongside protein or whole fruit instead might serve you better than a large glass of juice on its own. Let's talk a bit more about why these 3 specific habits were chosen for today's discussion, out of the many possible morning habits worth examining. Each of these 3 represents an extremely common, largely automatic behavior that most people have never consciously questioned. Each carries a specific, well-understood physiological mechanism explaining exactly why it matters more after 50 than in earlier decades, and each has a genuinely simple, low-effort fix that doesn't require dramatically restructuring your entire morning or purchasing anything new. This combination of being common, consequential, and easily correctable is exactly why these 3 habits, out of countless possible morning behaviors, tend to offer some of the most meaningful return for the smallest amount of effort and adjustment required. It's worth spending a moment on the phone-checking habit specifically, since for many people, this represents the most deeply ingrained and psychologically difficult of the 3 habits to change, given how normalized checking a phone immediately upon waking has become across nearly every age group. If keeping your phone entirely out of the bedroom feels too significant a change to attempt right away, a smaller intermediate step involves simply changing your phone's physical location within the room, moving it from your nightstand to a dresser or shelf across the room, so that reaching for it first thing requires a conscious decision to get up and walk over, rather than the nearly unconscious reach that happens when a phone sits within arm's length of where you sleep. This small physical barrier alone tends to meaningfully reduce how often people check their phone within the first several minutes of waking, simply by adding a brief pause between the impulse and the action. Let's also address the stage transition out of bed a bit further, since this habit, more than the other 2, has a direct, immediate safety implication worth taking seriously. If you've noticed any pattern of morning dizziness, lightheadedness, or unsteadiness upon standing, even if it's never resulted in an actual fall, this is genuinely worth mentioning to your doctor directly, since persistent orthostatic hypotension can sometimes be connected to specific, identifiable causes, including certain medications, dehydration, or other underlying conditions that benefit from direct evaluation rather than simply being managed through the stage transition technique alone. The stage transition is a helpful, protective habit for essentially everyone over 50, but it's not necessarily a complete substitute for medical evaluation if you're experiencing a persistent, ongoing pattern of morning dizziness. Let's also briefly address the role your bedroom environment plays in supporting these 3 adjustments, since a few small setup changes tend to make the fixes discussed today considerably easier to maintain consistently. Keeping a glass of water on your nightstand, for instance, gives you something calm and simple to reach for during that first quiet stretch after waking, rather than reaching for your phone out of sheer habit when your hands are looking for something to do. Similarly, having your morning breakfast ingredients, whether eggs, yogurt, or oats, already visible and accessible in your refrigerator or pantry, rather than needing to search for them each morning, removes a small barrier that might otherwise tempt you toward a quicker, less protein-forward option simply out of convenience on a rushed morning. And placing a sturdy chair or piece of furniture within easy reach of your bed specifically to support the stage standing transition means that helpful support is already in place rather than something you need to remember to seek out in the moment. It's also worth mentioning that these 3 adjustments tend to reinforce each other's benefits over time rather than functioning as 3 entirely separate, unconnected habits. A calmer, less phone-stimulated first few minutes tends to make the slower, stage transition out of bed feel more natural rather than rushed, and a body that's transitioned more gradually from lying to standing without a jarring blood pressure drop tends to arrive at breakfast feeling steadier and less inclined to grab whatever's fastest and most convenient, supporting the more thoughtful, protein-inclusive breakfast choice discussed as the third adjustment. In this way, addressing all three together, even gradually over a period of weeks, tends to produce a more noticeably calmer, steadier overall morning than addressing any single habit in isolation. Perhaps caring for a spouse, managing an early work commitment, or simply feeling that any additional minutes added to their morning routine feel genuinely difficult to accommodate. The good news is that none of these three adjustments require significant additional time. Delaying phone checking by 5 to 10 minutes doesn't extend your morning at all. It simply reorders what happens during time you're already awake. The stage transition out of bed adds perhaps 1 to 2 extra minutes at most compared to standing up immediately. And adding a source of protein to your existing breakfast, such as adding an egg to toast you were already planning to eat, or choosing plain yogurt with fruit rather than a sugary cereal, doesn't necessarily require additional preparation time, simply a different, equally quick choice. And what about people who have tried adjusting one or more of these habits and found that old patterns crept back in after a few days? This is an entirely normal part of changing any deeply automatic behavior, and it doesn't mean the adjustment has failed or isn't worth continuing to pursue. Simple environmental changes tend to support lasting habit change more reliably than willpower alone, which is exactly why physically relocating your phone, rather than simply intending not to check it, tends to be more effective and sustainable over time. Similarly, keeping a visual reminder, such as a sticky note on your nightstand reminding you to sit at the edge of the bed before standing, can help reinforce the new pattern during the initial weeks until it becomes genuinely automatic, replacing the old, more abrupt habit. Let's talk briefly about how these three habits interact with each other, since they're not entirely independent of one another. Checking your phone immediately upon waking often correlates with a more rushed, hurried general pace to the rest of your morning, since a stressful message or a piece of concerning news can leave you feeling behind schedule before you've even gotten out of bed, which in turn makes the slower, staged transition out of bed feel like an inconvenience you don't have time for, and can similarly make a rushed, grab-whatever's quick breakfast feel more appealing than taking a few extra minutes to include protein. In this way, addressing the phone habit first, even before tackling the other two, can create a calmer overall mental state that makes the other two adjustments feel more natural and less like additional items on an already rushed to-do list. It's also worth mentioning that these three specific mornings habits connect to a broader pattern worth watching for over time, since if you notice all three tend to cluster together on particularly stressful or hectic days, whether due to travel, an early appointment, or a poor night's sleep, this can serve as a useful, personal signal that those particular days deserve extra intentionality around your morning transition, even if you've successfully built better habits during your more typical, relaxed mornings. Now let's summarize everything in a simple way. The three things you should never do right after waking up after 50 are reaching immediately for your phone within the first few minutes of waking, which compounds your body's natural cortisol surge with additional stress or stimulation before it has a chance to settle. Sitting up and standing quickly without any gradual transition, which can overwhelm your body's slower, less efficient blood pressure regulation reflex and increase the risk of dizziness or falls, and eating a breakfast heavily weighted toward refined carbohydrates and sugar without any accompanying protein, which can produce a more pronounced blood sugar spike and subsequent energy crash than the same breakfast would have caused in earlier decades. Each of these habits is extremely common, rarely questioned, and yet each carries a genuine, specific physiological reason to reconsider it after 50, along with a simple, low-effort fix that doesn't require dramatically overhauling your entire morning routine. But remember, the goal here isn't to feel anxious or hypervigilant about every single moment of your morning. It's simply to recognize these three specific, common patterns and make small, deliberate adjustments that give your body a gentler, more supported transition from sleep into the busier demands of your day, rather than compounding an already significant physiological transition with additional, avoidable stress. So tomorrow morning, choose just one of these three adjustments to focus on first, whether it's moving your phone across the room, practicing the stage transition out of bed, or adding a source of protein to your breakfast. Once that single change starts feeling more natural after a week or two, add the second adjustment and then the third. Small, sequential changes like this tend to stick far better than attempting to overhaul your entire morning routine all at once. Now, I want to hear from you. Which of these three habits did you recognize most clearly in your own morning routine? And have you noticed any of the specific effects described today, whether dizziness upon standing, a mid-morning energy crash, or a sense of starting your day already stressed after checking your phone? Share your experience in the comments below. Your story may help someone else watching this video reconsider a habit they've likely never questioned before. If this video helped you, please like, subscribe to Nutri, and turn on notifications so you don't miss more simple, practical health strategies for adults over 50. And next, Watch our video on the morning routine that helps lower blood pressure in 4 weeks, because avoiding these 3 habits and building a supportive morning routine work together, giving your body every advantage as it transitions from rest into the busy hours of your day.